Pray with me. Gracious God, the words of my mouth, the meditation of all of our hearts, be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. When I first glanced at the lectionary text for this Sunday morning, my first reaction was, yes, Gospels. I love preaching from the Gospels. I love preaching from the Gospels. Jesus is always up to something, right? I mean, he's doing cool stuff. Jesus does cool stuff. And, I mean, he's healing people. He's transforming boring weddings into great parties. He's sticking it to the Pharisees. And then I actually looked at the passage. And I was like, what? Crucifixion? I mean, here we are preparing for Advent, preparing to enter into this time of waiting. We're going to celebrate Christ's coming. Whoever made up the lectionary, man. So I started to get anxious as I read it, and I relayed this to many of my friends. I thought, I don't want to preach on the crucifixion right now. I don't want to write this sermon. Crudely, I thought, everybody already knows that one anyways. I thought, I already know that one. I take it that one of the things a sermon is supposed to do is make the familiar strange. But when I read this passage over and over and over again, anxiety built in my bones because it was all familiar and no strange. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I read these stories I've heard hundreds of times or over and over again, I feel a little numb. Stories are familiar and I'm rarely surprised. Perhaps you're like me. Perhaps you've read this story of the crucifixion hundreds of times. You know the basic details. Jesus died on the cross. He died on the cross for us, for the whole world. So I ask myself, how do I read this text? How do we read this text so that it is strange to us? One possibility is to talk about the scandal of the cross. The cross should be, after all, pretty disturbing, pretty disrupting, pretty shocking to us. I mean, how could an instrument of torture be the central piece of our faith? This form of execution, as you probably know, was reserved for the worst, for the most treacherous. It was the sign that the Roman Empire used to kind of declare or pronounce their domination and power to everyone around. And here we have the Son of God, the one Israel had been waiting for, to come and reestablish their power, to reestablish their position. I mean, the disciples, after all of this, after Jesus dies, and as Nate so likes to say, spoiler alert, he rose again from the dead. So after he is raised, the disciples still, in the book of Acts, are like, dude, now's the time, right? We're doing this whole kingdom thing. You're pretty invincible now. I mean, if ever there was a time for us to start, building this kingdom, now's the time. I mean, they still didn't get it, right? Can we imagine, maybe as we're reading this, a worse ending to a story about someone who loved so greatly, who healed so many and worked so tirelessly for the marginalized? When we read this story, we should experience, oh, wait, what kind of moment? This can't be the way it goes. Jesus can't die. So this is a strange way to read this. This story is messed up. Another possible way to make the story strange is to kind of talk about the cost of discipleship. After all, Jesus invites his disciples to count the costs earlier in this gospel. We're getting to see, he says, he asks them that you're going to have to pick up your cross and follow me. We're getting to see maybe how literally Jesus meant that. It's interesting, too, in this text that Simon the Cyrene, who's pretty much unknown throughout the rest of the gospel, is the one who actually carries Jesus' cross. You have to wonder where his own disciples were. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is perhaps known best for developing this thing when he wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship. I don't know, it was in German, but I can't pronounce that. I'm not going to try. But Bonhoeffer was a German Lutheran pastor during the time that Hitler came into power. And when the war became inevitable, his friends tried to get him out of Germany safely. And in 1939, some of his friends from America got him out. And he was in New York for a while, and he had a chance to stay in New York teaching. And he came to the conclusion that there was no way that he could stay here while the atrocities were taking place in Germany. When he wrote to Reinhold Niebuhr, another theologian, he said, I would have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. See, before Bonhoeffer, the cross signaled God's sharing in the suffering of the world in Jesus Christ. He understood that radical grace meant radical discipleship. Indeed, discipleship is costly. Thinking about the cost of discipleship reveals this story as strange, because it's not just about Jesus dying. It's about us dying too. These are ways in which we can read this story so that it's strange to us. They both give us kind of new lenses to read this story through. And I imagine you've heard sermons on these themes. I imagine some of you have even preached sermons on these themes. I know I have. But they say that you write sermons that you need to hear. And neither one of these options really worked for me. I'm familiar with the scandal of the cross. As Trey mentioned a couple of weeks ago, God exposed God's self to the worst of human suffering on the cross. I think it's, one of the most compelling and meaningful themes in Christian theology. The cross stands as God's cosmic announcement that Jesus is Lord, and assures us that we're never alone in our suffering. I'm also familiar with the cost of discipleship. Bonhoeffer is the theologian that saved my faith in college and the early years of graduate school. I often told my middle school students to be careful, I think to their surprise, to be careful about following Jesus. That actually Jesus warns people about following him as much as he doesn't invite them. So I warned them that the cost of discipleship is real. It's certainly worthy of a sermon. But like I said, none of these options work for me. I'm sorry if that's what you needed to hear this morning. You're not getting either of those sermons. What's strange to me about this text, as I read it over and over again, is the sentence that Jesus utters from the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. This is a strange sentence. It's strange because the people think they know what they are doing. They think they are killing a rebel. They think they are squashing a rebellion. They think that they are in charge of history, that they are somehow controlling it and the outcomes. And the reason they're comfortable killing Jesus, if we're going to get down to it, is that they couldn't imagine that Jesus would show up like he did. God would not become king like this. They had no qualms about killing Jesus because he just couldn't be who he claimed to be. But Jesus knew that they were trapped inside a history that they could not understand, inside a world that they could not make sense of. He knew that despite what they were doing, they were missing it big time. I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we are missing it too. We all in some way do not know what we are doing, even when we think we do. For me, it works like this. And probably one of the reasons I didn't want to write this sermon. I am like the crowd. I am like the criminal. I am like the centurion. In other words, God isn't showing up in my life right now like I thought God would. In fact, lately I feel I'm constantly picking a bone with God. I can put myself out there. God is not where God said God would be. But perhaps I think I know what I am doing, when in fact I do not. This text forced me to consider the possibility that God works unexpectedly. That God shows up unexpectedly. And so in the crowd, and the criminal on the cross, and the centurion, even the disciple that abandons Jesus when he goes to the cross. And so are you. We all are. And that's what makes this pronouncement of Jesus, this forgiveness, so incredibly, strangely beautiful. This pronouncement is for the pious and the rebellious, for the criminal and the priest, for those that lament that God isn't showing up the way they want, and for those who don't think God could show up at all. The good news is that Christ meets us with forgiveness, even and perhaps especially when we do not know what we are doing. If anyone in the course of history stood in a position to condemn anyone, it's Jesus from the cross. The words on the lips of the centurion confirm this. This man was innocent. This is the kind of king Jesus is. The unexpected, innocent, and forgiving king who suffers loss to expose how limited, corrupt, and perhaps violent the history we are trapped inside of truly is. I know this artist in Chicago, and he keeps 2 sets of lyrics on the doors to his studio. He's got these giant French doors into his studio. And on the left side, he's got the lyrics, "If there's one thing you can't lose, it's that feel." And on the other side, "Come on up to the house." Now, both these lyrics are from 2 different Tom Waits songs. So, if you know Tom Waits at all, I wish I could give you an impression. Just go watch The Dark Knight, the new Batman movie, because I guess Heath Ledger mimicked Tom Waits in that movie, which is kind of creepy if you think about it. That's an aside. So both of these lyrics are from Tom Waits songs. Alright? There's one thing you can't lose, it's that feel. And come on up to the house. And as this artist tells it, by feel, Waits is not talking about like the groove of the song or the pocket, right? Or even like teenage nostalgia. He's talking actually about the struggle of living in the world. This lingering desire for control and the emptiness we kind of carry around with us. Waits is not celebrating the feel, he's lamenting it. He's lamenting it. I just can't lose this feel. So on the other side, he's got "Come on up to the house." And that's a song about accepting and living from forgiveness. He keeps it on the other side of the door to always remind him that even though he might feel lost, forgiveness is always available. The doors to the house are open, inviting him to come on, live in it. I'm not sure if there's a better picture of this than what we're about to experience, what we're about to witness this morning in baptism. I mean, baptism is a sign that we, in fact, do not know what we are doing, but we are willing to trust that God is moving, that God is working in ways we can only grasp by faith. In baptism, we claim God's forgiveness in Jesus Christ. My friends, we live our lives somewhere between thinking we know what we are doing and the forgiveness that's available and offered to us in Jesus Christ. Between rejecting the King for the ones that we've crowned for ourselves and being welcomed by the very King we reject. The good news is that even when we don't know what we are doing, Jesus says, "Come on up to the house." Amen.